Hi, this is Chris Hicks. It's currently September 25th, and you're about to hear an interview I did with Janice Uible, who is sister-in-law of David Uible and was married to his now deceased older brother, Dick Uible, who was a paranoid schizophrenic and dealt with mental illness issues for all of his life. Before we get to that interview, I just want to give a little bit of an update. Commissioner Uible has announced that he is dropping his baseless temporary protection order against me. But I want to take us through some of the things that have happened since that order. In the order itself, this is what one of the lines that Commissioner Uible used about me. It says, "I am very concerned about my welfare with this man who seems delusional and textbook psychotic." So labeling of me. Then we get to some articles in the press. Resident escorted from county commissioner's meeting. Uible receives civil protection order against resident. And then the last one I'll highlight here is Clermont County Commissioner gets restraining order against textbook psychotic critic of FC Cincinnati. So I end up getting labeled and demonized in the press by my elected official, to which I was asking legitimate questions. A friend of mine told me that this is called gaslighting, where you use sensational claims and accusations against a person to try to distract everybody from your own lack of transparency and lack of accountability to questions that are being asked. Folks, I asked legitimate questions to my government about this FC Cincinnati scheme. I did so only after I found out that my elected officials in Union Township had been kept completely in the dark on the entire plot and everything that was involved with that plot. So, as a result of the questions I asked, we've learned amazing things. We've learned that Commissioner Uible made a direct threat to a hotel general manager to have him fired unless that manager would publicly endorse Commissioner Uible's tax scheme. We learned that Commissioner Uible and Jeff Birding and others took a secret trip to Atlanta in 2016 around this scheme. We learned that in early 2017, a fake, fraudulent list of supporters was put together, it seems in an attempt to trick, which worked, Representative Doug Green into putting it into the budget. So we've learned quite a bit. The questions that I have asked have been very legitimate, and that none of them deserve this kind of labeling of I'm a textbook psychotic. What they deserved was answers. So in the interview you're going to hear with Janice Uible, however, you're going to hear a story that's, to me, quite painful, of how a family reacts to mental illness within a family. Her husband, Dick Uible, was a paranoid schizophrenic. He was basically disowned and embarrassment to the family. And then he needed a kidney transplant, which she provided, and you're going to hear that story. He ultimately passed in 2005. The key thing I want us all to take away from this is that we need to come to grips with mental illness as a disease. It's not something to be embarrassed of. It's not something that you hide your relatives, deny them, keep it secret. You know, my key points that I focus on are transparency, integrity, honesty, and things of that nature. This is a very important video for that because it has to do with being transparent about yourself. Being able to be honest with yourself when it comes to very serious matters, and how we can move forward from a situation in which political leaders feel like it's okay to take people asking legitimate questions and demonize them as textbook psychotics, while at the same time maybe not coming to grips fully with themselves and with their own family's history of very important issues. The first area that I want to ask you about is how you met Dick Uible, and what led up to you getting married, and then kind of what happened after that. So Janice, if you could just share with me a little bit of that background.
I met Dick at a party, and we immediately hit it off.
And that was what year? And that was what year?
That was in 1969, October, and we were married by the end of the year.
And you met his family when?
I met his family on Thanksgiving Day. And then his parents invited my parents over, so there was a conversation between the parents. So, from what I saw, this was a well-off family. The father, a lawyer, 9 children. Everything looked picture perfect.
And the 9 children, there were 6 girls and 3 boys, and the oldest was Dick?
Dick was the oldest, and his brother Woody was next, and then his brother David was the youngest of all of them.
Okay, so you got married to Dick by the end of 1969, and then what happened after you had been married to him for a while?
I realized almost immediately when I was under his roof, so to speak, that there was a problem. And finally, one night, I just went to the Uible's house, and knocked on the door. It was probably late, and I insisted they talk to me, and I said, "What is wrong with Dick?" And that is when they told me about his many hospitalizations, about when he was in the service, about when they had had him in private hospitals, that they had private paid. And I said, "Why did you not tell me this?" "Well, we thought it would stop the marriage." Right there, I should have known. I'm dealing with a cold cookie.
Okay, so that was the first time, so you found out about this or started to find out about this, and before that, he had been in the service, and from what I understand from what you told me, he had been honorably discharged after 181 days. Why don't you just say something about his service experience at your work?
When he was not drafted, he volunteered. But this was during the Vietnam era, and people were trying to act crazy to keep out of the service. But obviously, if somebody volunteers, they're not going to act crazy. They're volunteering. They want to go. Mm-hmm. He went to boot camp, and that is when he had a psychotic break. He was shuffled off to the Valley Forge Hospital, and on day 181, he was given an honorable discharge, which should have been a medical discharge.
Okay. So some of the results of that, I think, probably had to do with later when you try to get benefits and so forth, makes it more difficult.
It made it difficult because when I tried to get records, of course, records that you're trying to get that they don't want you to get have mysteriously disappeared or were in a fire. And so I had to keep on documenting what was going on and relating what I knew.
Okay. So, and then I think you told me that after that you had found out that subsequent to his military service, he had been in some private institutions, and I think you told me about Jewish Hospital being one of those.
He had been at Jewish Hospital, and his parents had private paid, which, of course, if you don't have insurance, if you're uninsured, it's going to cost. They really did not want to admit that there was a problem. And I can understand. There was so much stigma attached to mental illness. I believe people are becoming more educated. People are becoming more understanding. And when 1 out of 5 Americans have some type of a mental illness, it has to be dealt with.
Now at this time, though, I don't think you still knew the full diagnosis. Eventually, you find out, and maybe just what was his ultimate diagnosis, and what was the mental illness that he had?
His diagnosis was schizophrenia, the paranoid type. There are different types, different varieties. His was called paranoid, and he had hallucinations. And he also had impairments where he thought that he was hearing voices. A doctor told me it would be like if you had the radio on in one corner of the room and the television on in the other. You would be bombarded with sound.
Okay. So one of the events that you told me about was around 1980, late 1980, 1981. So you had been married for a while, I think at various times because of some of the violent tendencies of a paranoid schizophrenic, you kept separate residences or separate apartments. And then you told me a story about him being put on a bus to the drop-in center and where he ended up. And why don't you talk to us a little bit about that experience?
When he was living out at the Uibles at one point, his mother got so frustrated with his behavior, not taking his medicine, not bathing, not being appropriate. She gave him a $5 bill and drove him to the corner of Montgomery Road and didn't care where he ended up. He told me he went to the drop-in center, but ultimately he was in Washington, D.C., and this was in 1981 when John Hinckley, who had the same diagnosis, ironically, he shot President Reagan. At that time, they began to recognize the homeless sleeping on the benches in Washington. They were troubled. They were not just bums. They had mental illnesses.
So I think you told me then after Reagan got shot, the police, the authorities rounded up a lot of people and they picked him up as part of this. And then what happened?
Basically did a circle, and anybody within there, because there could have been an accomplice with Hinckley, they took them in. He had a public defender who thought that his family would like to know where their son was. Somehow, Dick must have told him that his father was a lawyer. So the defender called the office, thinking this man would be so glad to know. And his father did oblige by sending airfare to come home. From there, he was over at the VA hospital, but they were getting ready to discharge him because he was not a medical veteran. And they would do nothing to try to get him medical privileges. There was a meeting. The Uibles claimed they were too old, too ill, too frail.
To care for him.
And they called me. I went down and saw him down there. I could not be hardened. I had started a new life. I really didn't want to, but I just couldn't.
But you were still married at this time?
We were, we were married, and then at one point I divorced him. Okay. And then I remarried him so that I could get him onto my insurance. Okay. And basically, it was more like a compatible relationship. It was not like your typical marriage.
Okay.
And I had my own life.
So he ended up, I think you told me he ended up where you had your apartment and his apartment next to yours during that time.
Yes, it was by luck or God that the apartment next door opened up. The guy knocked on my door and he said, I want to leave. Do you know how I can break the lease? I said, I sure do. I'll take it.
Okay.
And we made arrangements, and because this gave me, they told me if the violence that goes along with paranoid schizophrenia, if it erupted, it would be toward the people closest to him. Well, there was only one people close to him. It was me.
Right.
And even though I was working at night and day, I didn't quite feel comfortable knowing that there could be, not because he wanted to, but because of the illness, it would come out in the form of violence.
Okay. I don't want to mention any names, but names of siblings right now are kids. Just but you told me about one incident where somebody, let's not say their names, was concerned with the way one of their children was behaving, and went to the mother to ask about was there any history of a psychological or mental illness in the family, and then maybe just talk about that again without any names, of just to protect the people.
This person wanted a complete family history. I don't know what the problem was, but she wanted to know medical, psychological, because of her child. And this is really not uncommon, especially today. They want to know because so many things come down the pike. And she would not. She told her everybody was fine. That was
so the mother told her that there was no issue.
Everybody was fine.
And then later, you.
Well, she called me, and I told her the truth. And I also had learned enough by then to know that this could either skip a generation or it could be within. And she was really glad I told her. I don't know, well, she ended up repeating it that I had told her. So I really wasn't a favorite anyway, but I became less.
Because you had.
She was angry.
So do you think it was just because the family was embarrassed at this?
The family was ashamed. There's stigma and shame that was associated a lot with mental illness.
Okay.
Today, due to groups like NAMI is one of them. It's a group that is a support for the family and the siblings. People are educated.
Well, one of the things I think is important is, I can go eat a lot of Big Macs and have more likelihood to have heart disease. Okay, I could go do a lot of drugs and have more likelihood of having mental issues. But most everybody that has physical disease or mental ailments, it's not something they chose. It's not something they did. It's just something that manifests itself in a person, and it's just extremely unfair that families or people either demonize it or treat the people as outcasts. To me, I've thought about it a lot more because of these incidents, and whether I, God forbid, get cancer someday or I had a mental illness someday, it's a disease. These are diseases or issues with brain chemistry people have, and if people are embarrassed, if people won't share it, then it only makes it worse. Say, for example, for a child that might need treatment that is not getting the proper treatment because the family is embarrassed to tell the medical history that has been involved.
And it's not a disease of choice like shooting up heroin or cocaine. Nobody says, I think I'm going to become a schizophrenic. I think I'm going to become bipolar. I think I'm going to become depressive.
Well, let's go forward to circa 2002. So your husband, Dick, has kidney disease. Something I know from my wife's, my mother-in-law had kidney disease. So he has kidney disease. The natural thing is for family members to be tested and for a match. Why don't you talk a little bit about kind of that era and what happened at that time?
Well, it started in like 2000, 2001. The first thing they wanted to do is test the family, because at that time they were under the impression that a sibling or someone related was a better match. This was presented to the siblings. It was also discussed. I discussed it with the father, who had been in the law profession, and I asked him, can you mediate this and maybe present it in a better way than I would? Or he would not. So Dick said, I want to talk to them. Okay.
Your husband did?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm standing and listening to him, almost begging to be tested.
So just for people to be tested to know if there's a suitable match.
Just to be tested. And he was a blood type O, so he needed an O.
Okay.
So if they were not the right blood type, they would have been out right then.
Already. Okay.
Okay, everybody was saying, I'll get back to you. I'll call you back. I know that when you ask a question like that, it's either a yes or a yay or a no.
Anything other than a yes is a no.
Mm-hmm. And after several weeks, I said, enough. You call them back. We'd also had a conversation with another sibling and her husband. And I realized that it was like Dick was the black sheep of the family. The same person's husband took it upon himself to tell Dick later that he wasn't worth it. I don't know if he meant emotionally, financially, or what. All these hurtful things. I could not control myself. I said, I'm going to call. No, don't. You might make it worse. I said, it can't get any worse. It's a no. It can only go up. Maybe if I talk to them.
And so what happened?
They hemmed and hawed, and I knew it was a definite no. There was nobody going to go be tested. There was nobody going to even care. And at that point, I probably blasted him, but it was my husband. I loved him.
So after, it's interesting that you say that, by the way. I want to stop there for a second. As you said, it was your husband, I loved him. You've been through all this stuff. Okay, divorced, remarried, worried about violence, all these apartments, and you still say, it was my husband, I loved him.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just very moving to me, because I think about, I was even talking with my wife about, there's all kind of people that could say you have a good marriage, a bad marriage on given days. But you were in a circumstance where where you never had the opportunity to have the dream book marriage. You never had the opportunity to have a picture book. You were forever burdened with somebody, but you still say, I loved him and is my husband. So I just wanted to stop there, because I think it's very moving and very important.
In the vows, in sickness and in health, better for worse. Does anybody hear it? And
right.
If you break a vow to God and every witness, then who can trust you doing anything else? So.
Well, let's come back to that, but just for, you then ended up getting tested. You then ended up being miraculously a match, which is very unusual. You give a kidney, okay, and then there's a story in the newspaper about it, okay, and I've seen that. I actually have it. No, it's on, December 25th. You can go look it up online. December 25th, 2002, it says, she gave something of herself, wife's transplanted kidney, saves husband in desperate need. And, so this appeared, and it's a beautiful, moving thing. And I don't mean to put too much pressure on you, but how did the family react to this being in print?
They were furious. I think I've always been like a loose cannon. What's she going to do next? I was very kind, though, in saying that everybody had been ruled out. Well, they hadn't even stepped up to the plate.
So then, so that all happened, and now where we're sitting right now is at the Kingsgate Marriott on the University Hospital kind of campus here at UC. And you know this place well, because when you were both laid up, as you said earlier, when you were giving your kidney and he was receiving the kidney and had recoup time and so forth, so you knew this hotel very well. And at a time when it seemed to me on the story you told, you were really desperate for people to help, this place has a special meaning to you. and about the staff and the people. So maybe say a few words about the Kingsgate Marriott and the staff here and how they treated you.
They were wonderful. They went beyond the call of, well, they were tickled by a sign that I had put on the door when Dick was released from the hospital, and it said, "Welcome home, little kidney." And they told me later that everybody had gone up and taken a look at it. It was a handmade little sign.
On the door of the hotel room?
The door of our room, yeah.
Okay.
And they knew what our situation was. Everybody from the waitresses to the shuttle driver, who also, ironically, was in kidney failure. It's very common. These people here were wonderful. I cannot say enough good things about them.
Now, after this, now your then husband had about, 3 more years, and then you were back here because his health took a turn for the worse at that point.
Well, they thought he had a tumor. Then when they opened him up, 5 minutes later, they called me back. The surgeon, Dr. Rafferty, said, I peeked through the door and I saw her leaning against the wall. And I thought, gee, something bad must have happened to somebody. I didn't put 2 and 2 together. She came into the room and she looked at me and she said, "The liver is covered." And I had a notepad, and I said, "What size?" She told me the centimeters. I wrote that down, and then I said, "Can I give him part of my liver?" Mm-hmm. And I think she felt sorry.
You're going to run out of parts.
She said, "Well, my liver would have regenerated." Yeah. So she said, "No, not with him being a kidney transplant." And she said, "I believe it has metastasized."
So then in 2005, your husband eventually passes, and you're here, and he gets buried in Dayton, and you told me a very moving story about the people here at the hotel again, and who was at the service. Why don't you share that as we wrap up?
When the life support was removed, then he died, and the funeral would be a military funeral at the National Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. One of the employees here, Mark Krause, he said, "I'm going to be off tomorrow. I can take you." He heard me asking if people knew how to get to Dayton. I feel like he knew that I needed help. It was like there were so many angels that helped in different ways. Mark picked me up here, and then we went to the funeral home, and they allowed me to go in and see Dick, and I put a little letter I'd written, I put that in the casket. He was buried in his brand new suit. And after we went up there, I realized that he was not there, but he was in my heart. And the part of me was in heaven, and someday I would get to go in through the kidney donor door, and our kidneys would find each other.
So Mark took you. Who else was at the funeral or the service?
There were military people. They do an excellent job. Anyone who is honorably discharged is able to, if there is space, they do not take any reservations.
But of the 8 siblings?
I did not notify them because he did not want them notified. He did not want.
And why do you say, why did he not want them notified?
After they would not be tested. We didn't hear from them even. So he did not want them to be there at his funeral. His Uncle Howard, who was in a nursing home, was ill. As soon as he was well enough to tell, my mother and I went up there. And then I put the notice in the paper. And I mentioned the schizophrenia.
In the death notice.
In the death notice. Because I felt that it was important. Because that was a big battle in his life.
It really probably defined the majority of his life.
He had fought a valiant fight against schizophrenia, cancer, and kidney failure and cancer.
So one of the things I remember I noticed you posting in the news, and then contacted you, and you told me when I talked to you yesterday that at first you thought I was crazy, and then you watched some of the videos online, and the particular video where Mr. Uible's in my face saying, do you need help? We can get you help. That's what really caused you to reach out, and maybe if you just want to share your thoughts on that.
Actually, the one where he said textbook psychotic, that hit me, and I realized he was somehow, well, that is, if you're not a doctor, you better not call somebody textbook.
Anything.
Any kind of diagnosis. And then when I saw the one where he was in your face, and I realized he was transferring feelings, probably feelings of guilt, onto you. But they were actually his. I don't think he came from a family that didn't deal with feelings. So you continue on unless you change. And he has not changed.
Okay, well, Janice, I appreciate you taking the time to sit down here with me. And I think one of the key things, my wife always says everything happens for a reason. And one of the things with talking to you and talking about these issues isn't really meant to single people out, or you get in the moment, you can get mad at somebody, but I really take from all of this a story about how people treat other people when they have challenges, how people show love and respect for each other when things aren't perfect.
Especially when someone is a public figure and they're having a recognition of veterans and disabled people and other things, and they don't even mention anything about their own experience. It's so phony. But I almost have to pity somebody like that, how miserable they must feel when the lights go out and when they are alone. And someday they will have to answer to a higher power. And it won't be the voters.
Well, here's my thing is, all of us every person is a flawed person. And so I like to think more about the notion of that all of us have to take in what happens around us. And I like that. I was just at the start to my son earlier and said to somebody at our house, is that the meaning of the past is defined by what you do with it today and tomorrow. So none of us, all of us has opportunities to be better people. We all have opportunity to acknowledge things, be accountable, and be the kind of things, not to be all religious here, but to be the kind of things that Christ wants us to be, and to see Christ in those people around us that are not the sharp-dressed, rich people and so forth, but the lowest people, the people with the problems and the challenges that we're called to serve, I'm not an elected official, and I'm called to serve those people also. So, again, Janice, thank you for the time you spent with me here at the Kingsgate, Marriott. I know it brings back a lot of meaning to you, and I hope to. I know I asked you yesterday if you wanted to go to the cemetery in Dayton, and you told me there's only one time you want to go there, and you ain't coming back. Okay, so be that as it may, I hope that, you know, I like to say when that day comes, I'll come there with you. Okay, and so that well, I'm not coming hopefully I'm not going all the way with you, but I'll go. So I really appreciate it, and I hope that everybody takes this for what the intent of our time here is we just got to increase awareness, of the issues that every family faces, that every person faces. My wife and I talking about her grandmother was bipolar. You know, her mom's struggles with kidney dialysis. I have a cousin who is Down syndrome, and I tell you, I've never met a person that has brought more joy to more people than that man brings to people, and his name's Michael. And all these things, you know, life is not a textbook, a picture book, a Norman Rockwell picture. And in a weird sort of way, by acknowledging all those things, in a weird sort of way, it actually makes it a Norman Rockwell picture, because even the Norman Rockwell pictures weren't perfect. That's right. Okay, they were real people, real families, and so again, thank you, Janice, for the time that you spent here with us.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and remember, everybody's fighting a battle of some sort that you might not even know about.
I don't want to have to get a restraining order against you.
I don't think I'm harassing you at all. I asked you a question.
Do you need help? I need to ask people, because if you need help, we can find out.
What kind of help?
I don't know, sir, but we can get help if that's the case, because you seem not to get it.
Why don't we
continue to hassle me to the point where we have to have deputy sheriffs here because you don't leave it alone.